Founded in 1608 by Samuel de Champlain, the city of Quebec is without a doubt one of the most historically significant cities in North America. Throughout the 4 centuries of its existence, the fate of this city has been governed by the various human activities that are the foundations of Western civilization. Religion, politics, economy and culture have all left their mark on this World Heritage Site. In Quebec, you're in charge of a rich family whose goal is to acquire influence by building the city of Quebec. The game covers 4 centuries, during which you will build the most prestigious buildings and places of the city, all the while ensuring your presence in the great spheres of power. It is up to you and your adversaries to build Quebec in your colours.
All right. Thank you, he of the gorgeous British voice. All right. So what are you guys looking at? So on the main board, first off, we have the victory point track. Around the outside, around the outside, around the outside. The goal of the game is victory points. We will get into more of that here in a little bit. In the main part of the board here, we have 4 different colors of buildings, which these are the in construction or under construction site. On the flip side will actually be the buildings once they are completed. And these are broken down into column spheres of power. So we have individual building sites, which will have a number 1 through 4 Roman numerals. All the number 1s are covered by these blue discs because those show the active century. This game, as Martin said, takes place over 4 centuries. So we have all of the 1st century buildings here. These 2nd century buildings are the 2s, so on and so forth. Then within each of these, in their little zone of power, they have a special ability or a rule breaker, if you will, that when you contribute to these buildings are going to convey some sort of special ability for you. Then there are the 5 zones or spheres of power. We have the citadel here. We have the religious sphere over here. We have the political. We have the commerce up there in the corner, as well as the cultural spheres of power there. So that's pretty much what you're looking at here on the main board, as well as a reminder that all scoring at the end of each century will start with the citadel and then go and where it starts moving clockwise from there. So in the 1st century we will start here after the citadel. The 2nd century we will start here and go clockwise, so on and so forth. Then off board, we have the 5 different leader cards that are available for the players to select during their turn. We have the event deck, which there's going to be 1 event for each of the 4 centuries. Then within our own player tableau, we have our hand, which will hold our active workers. We have a supply of 19 inactive workers, 3 active to begin with. Everybody has 1 architect, as well as a 2nd architect that represents their scoring marker. And they have prestige markers here, which these prestige markers have 1, 2, or 3 stars, which are going to be how prestigious the building was during its construction and whether or not it gained more prestige through the construction of that building. So that's essentially everything that you're looking at. There's no need for a secondary camera for tonight because everything is contained within what you see here. Now, an overview of the game, what we're going to be doing is on our turn, we have 4 options on our turn, most of which is going to be putting our architect out here on the various active buildings, those with the blue discs out there, and then collectively contributing with our active workers or our cubes out onto those work sites, hoping to complete those buildings. When those buildings complete, or when the architect deems they are complete, those cubes will then go to their matching zone of power. So if, for instance, this building were built here, all the cubes on this building would end up over there. And then we continue along until one of 2 things triggers the end of the century. Either somebody runs out of all their workers or all their cubes, or all of the buildings have at least begun construction. If at that point, then we're going to go into scoring at the end of that century, which during the game, we will score approximately half of our points throughout the 4 scoring of each, or the 4 scorings, 1 at each end of the century, and then end game scoring at the end of the game based on contiguous group or your largest group scoring more points for you. Whoever has the most points wins. So big picture, that's what you're looking at. Now going into the details, let's go into it. As I mentioned, the game is played over 4 centuries. A century consists of roughly 100 years in history, starting with 1608 or thereabouts and moving forward. On any given century, there will be 11 buildings available to be built, or all 11 buildings will be built in the city of Quebec. It's just a matter of how prestigious those buildings will be. On a player's turn, they have 4 options on their turn. The first one is putting their architect out on the board or moving their architect to a different building to start a new building. The second option is to contribute to a building to add to its prestige. The third is to place an active worker into a zone of power. And the fourth option is to take one of the available leader cards. So now let's break down how each of those works. So we'll start with taking a leader. Very simple. You choose one of the 5 available leader cards, and that is going to be your special rule breaker for the remainder of that century or that round. When you take it, however many leaders have been taking previously, you're going to activate 1 worker from the inactive supply onto your active, i.e. put it onto your hand. So the first player has full choice, so they get no workers. But if somebody takes this leader in which to be able to put out for their player, then the second player, there's one of those taken, they will activate 1 worker, and then they will get whatever the special ability is of that leader. I'll go over those in depth before we get started with the game, but that's the actual mechanism. Any questions on that?
Nope.
All right. The second one, very simple. Taking 1 active worker, meaning a worker from your hand, and placing it into a zone of power. Citadel, religious building, political, commerce, or cultural. So literally taking 1 cube and putting it out there. Mm-hmm. It is not going to be an often used one, and it's usually not an important action until it is, right? So we'll go into the details of why that matters during the actual gameplay, but the mechanism, take 1, put it out on any of the 5 zones of power. If you do not have an active worker, you cannot take that action. Any questions on that? All right. The third option is to start a new building. At the beginning of the game, no architects are out here on the board, so to be able to begin, if I am the first player and I say I'm going to start a new building, I take my architect and then I move it to one of the available buildings which has a blue disc on it. I place it out there on that area. We're going to move that blue disc off screen, take it off the table, and then at that point I'm going to activate 3 of my workers from inactive to active, and boom, done. I have started a new building. Any questions on that?
No.
Nope.
All right. I'm going to circle back on what happens when you choose to start a new building once he's already on there. Once I talk about the 4th and final action, because it will give a little bit more context. And the 4th option is to actually contribute to a building. Once there are architects out here on the board, and let's say for argument's sake, Jess has already done this on a previous turn, etc., etc. So now it's Shrey's turn, and on his turn, he then can choose to contribute to one of these available buildings. So first off, how do you do that? Any workers that go to contribute to a building must come from your active worker supply first and foremost. Then you have to look into the zone or the area of influence for that building to see how many workers are going to be needed to contribute. So on each of these locations in the center or attached to that zone, so for instance, this yellow space here is attached to this yellow special ability, which also is these 2. So these 3 buildings are going to be dictated by both this prerequisite as well as this special ability. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, if Shrey on his turn wished to contribute to my building here, he would look and it shows that there are 2 workers that need to be contributed for a single contribution. So, if on his turn he chose to do so, he would take 2 from his active supply and place it onto one of the 3 contribution spaces out there. It does not matter if it's a 1 requirement, a 2 requirement, or a 3 requirement. Wherever that building is, they're all going to go into that 1 contribution space. So, for instance, what he's not doing is putting 2 cubes on there because that's a single contribution, which means it's going to go onto like that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. So then, By doing so, he then triggers whatever the special ability is of that location. And in this case, it says that he can take 3 inactive workers to then be able, or let me double check, sorry. It is, yes, passive or inactive workers to then contribute to any other building on the board that has an architect on it. So for instance, he then could contribute to this building. So this building requires 2 workers in which to do a contribution, so he would put 2 out there like so. However, this one does not allow the triggering of this special ability, so you can't keep chaining them. In addition, this specific one does not allow a second contribution to the building that triggered that contribution. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. So that is the mechanism in which to do so. Then on Martin's turn, maybe he does the exact same thing. So he chooses to go ahead and put 2 workers onto this location from his actual active workers
quite right. Yep.
from there. And then he would then say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and from my passive workers or inactive, take 2 more and put them out onto that location like so. Now, they do have the option to take a leader or to put their own architect out, etc., etc. But for our example, let's say they chose to do this. It comes back to my turn. Now let me double back to the whole starting a new building. Once a building has 3 contributions on it, nobody else can contribute to that building. Now, I could choose to contribute to my own building here by doing like so if I wish on my turn. That would be the 3rd and final contribution. Nobody else can contribute to that. However, when you contribute to where you have your architect, you do not trigger the special ability on that. So what I might want to do is instead possibly contribute to Jess's building, then I can do what the special ability is on that one. Does that make sense?
Yes.
But let's say I chose to do neither of those things, and instead I'm going to start a new building action, which is move my architect to a new building. Well, you can do so with 0, 1, 2, or 3 contributions where your architect is. In this case, it is specifically the 2 contributions, so I'm going to go ahead and get out the 2-star. If it were 0 contributions, I wouldn't bother because there were no contributions. It would just complete, but nobody gets credit for it. If it were 1, I would get 1. If it were 3, it were 3. So in this case, a few things are going to happen. First thing that's going to happen is this guy's going to move over to any other available building. So maybe I come over here and I choose this building here. So I do that. I then, because he moved, I then activate 3 new workers onto my active worker supply. Then from there, all of the workers, regardless of whose workers they are going to go into the zone of power that matches the color. So in this case, all of these guys would then go over into the yellow area. This building would then flip over as it's completed, but it's completed with a prestige of 2 stars there. And that is the mechanisms for moving your worker once there are already contributions on there, or once your architect is already out there. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Are there any questions about that mechanism right there?
Nope.
All right. We now have covered every available action in the game. So on Jess's turn, she then could contribute here, she could contribute there, but not trigger the special ability, or she could move her architect to a different building, completing like I just did. She could take a leader, or she could take a single one of her active workers and put it out there, so on and so forth. So as we go along, and let's just say it ended up something along the lines of like this, okay? When a player's turn begins and they have 0 workers available, either on their active or their inactive, the end of the century will trigger immediately. Or if somebody goes to move their architect and there are no blue discs left in which to move their architect onto. If that happens, we immediately go into an end of an era or an end of a century. And if you will allow me, let me get a bunch of workers out here. I know I'm messing up your organization, but let's say it were something along the lines of this. There would be more out here, but through various actions, we've put cubes out into the various zones of power. By doing so, when we get to the end of a century, we then go into the end of the century, which I will go through those steps. If anybody chose this leader, which is a second architect for the yellow one immediately completes no matter the amount of contributions, and those workers will then go to the various zones of power in which they belong. From there, we then return all of our leader cards up here, and then we're going to score the 5 zones of power. We're going to follow whatever century we're in. So at the end of the first century, we always start at the Citadel, and then we go to the next one as shown on the chart here. Here it would go to religious buildings, and then go clockwise from there. The reason is, I kind of have built up to this, saved my favorite part of this game. Very simple. Let's go through how scoring at the end of a century will go. Black would score 2 points. Orange would score 2 points. Green would score 3 points. Pink would score 3 points. Easy enough so far. Black would get their workers back to their inactive supply. Orange would do the same. But now, whoever has the most, or in this case tied for the most, this is friendly ties, they take half of their workers, rounded up, and put them back into their supply, and everything that's left, up to a total of 5, then cascades to the next zone of power. So in this case, then pink would score 1 more point, green would score 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, orange would score 6, 3, 6, all these would go back to their respective owners, hopefully a little bit easier than I just showed, to their inactive. So we have 3 and 4, so 4 of these would go back to Shrey's supply. The other 3 would then cascade to there. Orange would now score 3 more points. Half of those rounded up would go back. This would then cascade the yellow. So now orange is going to score 3 more points. Black would score 2. All those would go back to black. Just like that, that would then cascade to there, scores 1 more point. Half rounded up goes back to his supply, but throw a couple out there if you would, if it were like this, these 2 would go back to his inactive, and because this is the last zone of power, this then would go to his active, into his hand, and boom, thus we have ended the scoring for a given century. The second century would start with the Citadel, and start here and go clockwise. Third century starts there, goes, or Citadel, then there, 4th century there, and clockwise, etc., etc. The last thing we would do is, if there are any blue disc buildings still out there, we would then flip those over, which I imagine there will only be a max of 1 or 2. Then we will take all the blue discs and put them onto the next century building, and then move on to the next player's turn. Do that 4 times, then we go into final scoring. Final scoring is as simple as this. So you see these numbers that are also have stars on them. Each player's largest contiguous group of buildings at the end of the game will score the numerical value total for all of their buildings. Then, for every other building that isn't part of that contiguous group, they will count the number of stars and add those points up and peg those points. And any other scoring you'll get 1 point for any incomplete building or worker that you have out here in an incomplete building. You will score 2 points you will score a point for every 2 workers left on your hand, and whoever has the most points wins. And that is how you play Quebec. Now, we need to go over the special abilities of the leaders as well as the special abilities out here on the board. But other than that, any questions on how to play Quebec?
No, I think we're good. The only thing is, what happens to architects that are still on buildings at the end of a century?
They stay there until they move. So those buildings will technically be completed the following century, and whenever that player chooses to move their architect. Okay? So now we'll go ahead and go over the leaders first. Okay? So get a second architect. Okay? You don't get to move architects twice. You get to, just like you had a regular architect, So if this one's out there, when you place this out here and start a new building, you'll activate 3 workers, and that building will automatically complete wherever he is or she is at the end of the century. Any questions about that, leader?
Nope.
Normally, when you complete or when an architect moves to a new building, all of the workers that are on that building go on to the associated color building. If you choose this leader, anytime your workers will move to a certain color or a specific zone of power, you can choose any of the 4 on the outside, not the citadel as pictured here. This one is immediately when you take that leader, take 3 inactive workers and place them immediately into the citadel. No other special rule applies. This one here says whenever you complete a building, once you have chosen this leader this century, depending on the number of prestige, 1, 2, or 3 stars, score 2, 3, or 4 points respectively. And finally, this allows you to essentially do this action every time you take. Let me look this one up. I want to make sure that I don't misquote this. I apologize. The religious leader allows you to do the additional action where you contribute to the building you started with your architect. But notice it's with 3 cubes out of your hand. Any questions on that? I'm seeing weird looks.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't get that.
Okay. Allows you to do the additional action when you contribute to the building you started with your architect. So for instance, normally when I contribute to this building, I don't get to do the special ability of that building. But if I have this leader, I can.
Yeah.
So I get to do where my architect is.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense? Okay. All right, so those are the 5 leaders. Now let's talk about the various special rules. And I'm going to go over these very quickly so we can get started, but I think it's important to give context. So if we can, go ahead, take your architects back real quick. Oop, I stole that one. And let's reset all this up and put these back out while we're doing this, if you guys can help me figure out where I took those, and then we'll go over those. Okay. So we're going to start off with the religious buildings. There are 4 groups, so a single cube or a single worker to contribute, 2 that require 2 workers to contribute, and 1 that requires 3 to contribute. Any of each of the colors that have the question mark says when you contribute, you can choose, it's any of the 4 for the various colors, you can contribute to, or when you contribute, you can take the special ability of any of the associated color. So when you go here, you could do this one, or this one. Okay? So we'll start with this one. This is the Protestant district. From your inactive supply, add 1 worker to the citadel, and then take another from the inactive to any of the 4 zones of power on the outside. Easy enough. This one says, add 1 to your active, score 1 point. As you can see, the ship icon is shown there, so score 1 point there. And then another from the inactive to any of the 5 zones of power, including the citadel. And finally, over here, 1 from inactive to any of the 5 zones, and then up to 2 from 1 zone to 1 zone move around. So those are the religious buildings. Any questions on those? Good, moving on. Politics. The red one, you can, just like the others, you can choose any of the other 3 that are out here. These are very simple. Spend 3 workers to contribute. Take 2 workers from the inactive, place into the citadel. 2 workers from inactive into any of those 2 zones, and the opposite for that one. Easy enough.
Yeah.
Moving on to the economic one. The economic being the yellow. So this is doing any of the 3 there, or there. We'll start with the 3 one here, which is it costs 3 workers to go onto that space to contribute, but then take 3 workers and add them into your active. So it's essentially adding to that for free. Then this one says, just like we showed in the example, take 3 inactive and contribute to a second building, not 1 that is attached to that, and also do not take this special ability of the second building you contributed to. And this one is pretty cool. It allows you to do the start a new building, i.e. move your architect action. So if you wanted to move your architect, instead you could always take 2 workers to contribute to one of those if there's an architect there, then move your architect. So basically take 2 actions in one. Any questions on those?
Nope.
All right, the culture one is all about scoring points. So the blue area, again, doing any of the other 3, which is here, here, or here. This one says, depending on how many zones of power you have cubes in when you contribute, score 1, 3, or 4 points respectively. This one does the exact same, but it's based on how many workers you have on your active after contributing to the building there, and score 1, 3, or 4 points. This one says, remember earlier where I had the 2-star on that building? If I contribute to a building that is here, I get to turn that from a 2 to a 3-star by contributing any one building of my choice.
Right.
Those are all the buildings. If there's no other questions in the peanut gallery or locally,